My name is Ignacio Ledesma, and I have been working at the Central Hospital morgue for over 10 years. Here, where death is routine and the constant cold of the rooms reminds you that there is no escape, I learned to disconnect emotions and simply do my job. There is no room for surprises, or at least that's what I thought until today. This morning, I was informed that I would have a new assistant under my supervision. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Help is always useful, especially in a place like this, where the work is more physical than many imagine. What I didn't expect was to encounter someone like him. He arrived right on time. Andres Salgado. Tall, with messy hair and an easy smile, he radiated a charisma that seemed out of place in the morgue. From the very beginning, he was friendly, almost too much so. Dr. Ledesma. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to learn from someone with so much experience, he said, enthusiastically extending his hand. His attitude caught me off guard, so relaxed, almost excited. It wasn't common to find someone who faced their first day in the morgue with such enthusiasm. I gave him the usual tour, showing him every corner of our small world. Along the way, Andres constantly asked questions, not about procedures or techniques, but about the bodies themselves. Have you ever received anything out of the ordinary? He asked, his eyes shining in a way I couldn't interpret. At first, I assumed it was just curiosity. It wouldn't be the first time a newcomer was fascinated by the macabre. But there was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at the empty gurneys, that made me uneasy. That night, we received our first body together, a middle-aged man who had died in a car accident. It was a routine case, with nothing particularly interesting. Let's get started. You take notes, I'll handle the procedure, I instructed, handing him a notebook. He nodded, standing by my side as I began to work. As I explained each step, I noticed that Andres didn't take his eyes off the body, but it wasn't a look of scientific concentration. There was something more. When I made the first incision, I saw his eyes light up, as if he were witnessing something marvelous. Are you okay? I asked, pausing for a moment. Yes, doctor. It's fascinating. Please, continue, he said, his tone almost eager, as if he were enjoying the process a little too much. I didn't say anything, but the atmosphere began to feel strange. Andres asked questions that went beyond the professional, almost morbid. Do you think this man knew he was going to die? What did he feel when it happened? He asked, jotting down notes in his notebook. I ignored the question and kept working, but every move I made seemed to fuel his excitement. When I finished, I glanced at him. He was smiling, a slight but unsettling smile, as if he had found something deeply satisfying in what he had just witnessed. I asked him to clean up while I stored the body in the refrigerator. As I did, I couldn't help but notice something. The sheet covering the man had a slight fold, as if someone had touched the body after I left. I turned to Andres, who was busy with the instruments, humming a soft, strange melody. Did you touch the body? I asked, trying to sound casual. Me? No, doctor. I just cleaned the tools, he replied, looking at me with that same smile, as if he were enjoying my discomfort. The night ended without further incident, but I couldn't get his behavior out of my head. As I locked up the morgue, something in me knew that Andres Salgado wasn't like the others. His excitement wasn't that of a student fascinated by learning. It was something darker, something I didn't want to understand yet. That night, before falling asleep, I couldn't stop thinking about his gaze. There was something deeply unsettling in his eyes, as if he saw something in the corpses that I could never comprehend. Time passed as it always does. What began as an uncomfortable relationship with Andres Salgado turned into a stable routine. We worked together in the morgue for almost 5 years. At first, I couldn't ignore his unsettling behavior, but over time, I learned to accept his quirks. He was a good kid, or so I convinced myself. He was always willing to work overtime, never complained, and seemed to absorb knowledge like a sponge. There was something about his enthusiasm that, though strange, became almost comforting. After all, in a place as lonely as the morgue, it wasn't bad to have someone to share the long nights with. I was already tired. I had spent almost 34 years as a plastic surgeon before dedicating myself to forensic medicine. 15 years in the morgue had been enough for me. It was time to hang up my lab coat and find some peace in retirement. I clearly remember my last day with Andres. It was a quiet day, with no new bodies to receive or urgent autopsies. We spent the time cleaning and organizing, while Andres shared stories that, though sometimes too graphic for my taste, managed to make me smile. "Dr. Ledesma, I don't know how I'm going to handle this without you," he said at the end of the day, with that smile of his that I never knew if it was sincere or a little calculated. "You'll do fine, Andres. You've always had talent. Just remember that this job isn't just about technique, it's also about respect for the dead." He chuckled softly, as if my comment struck him as more sentimental than necessary, but he said nothing. In the end, we shook hands and said goodbye, a farewell that, though cheerful, carried an air of finality. Almost a year later, already retired, I saw his name in a local newspaper article. "Young forensic doctor becomes key figure for police forces," the headline read. The article talked about how Andres Salgado had revolutionized procedures at the hospital morgue. It said he almost always found the cause of death for the bodies that came in, even in the most complicated cases. I felt a strange pride reading it. Despite my initial doubts, it seemed Andres had found his place in this world. I thought about sending him a congratulatory message, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the feeling that I had already closed that chapter of my life, or perhaps there was something else. A restlessness I couldn't name. However, I convinced myself that everything was fine. I had done my part, and Andres was doing his. But, as always happens in these stories, things are not what they seem. And deep down, something told me I hadn't yet seen everything Andres Salgado had to show the world. I was 83 years old. I was an old man in every sense, with knees that creaked when I stood up and a memory that was starting to play tricks on me. My life was quiet, though lonely. I spent my days reading, watching old movies, and reminiscing about the years I worked at the hospital morgue. Sometimes, my mind wandered to Andres Salgado, my last work partner. I wondered what had become of him after those years in which, according to the newspapers, he seemed destined for great things. One afternoon, as I settled into my armchair, I received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end of the line was urgent. "Dr. Ledesma? We know you're retired, but the hospital is overwhelmed. Something terrible has happened. Please, we need you." Nostalgia hit me immediately. I remembered the cold hallways of the hospital, the faces of my former colleagues, and, of course, Andres. Although I knew my body wasn't what it used to be, something inside me pushed me to accept. If I could help even a little, I couldn't just sit at home. When I arrived at the hospital, the chaos was palpable. Ambulances came and went, the hallways were filled with people running back and forth. I signed a contract for legal reasons and was finally taken to a small office where they explained what had happened. "Dr. Ledesma, Andres Salgado?" The man speaking to me seemed unable to find the right words. He brought both doctors and patients to the morgue. Some were alive, others were already corpses. For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard correctly. Andres? The kid I had seen as a promising apprentice? The doctor I had felt proud of when reading about his achievements? I headed with a group of doctors to the morgue. The smell was unbearable, a mix of disinfectant, blood, and something else, something I couldn't identify but that made my stomach churn. When I entered, the scene was horrifying. There were gurneys with mutilated bodies, some wrapped in blood-soaked sheets. But the worst were the injured who were still breathing. Their bodies were torn apart, as if someone had tried to work on them as if they were experiments. One of the injured, a young man, had deep cuts in his abdomen. The skin had been opened with surgical precision, but the wounds hadn't been closed. The internal organs were exposed, partially removed, as if someone had examined them and left them half-finished. Another was a woman in her 40s. Her hands had been carefully skinned, leaving the muscles and tendons exposed. She seemed conscious, but her gaze was empty, as if she had lost all connection to reality. There was an elderly man on one of the gurneys, his eyes open and red. Both of his lungs had been punctured with millimeter precision, leaving small incisions that made it impossible to breathe properly. His chest rose and fell in a futile effort to cling to life. "They're beyond saving," said one of the doctors accompanying me, his tone trying to be professional but unable to hide his horror. Andres had done all of this. But what had driven him to turn the morgue into a nightmare? I looked around, searching for some clue, some answer. In the air, I could feel his presence, as if he were still there, watching. Suddenly, I remembered his smile, the way he looked at the bodies with something more than mere curiosity. Had there been something dark in him from the beginning, something I never wanted to see? As the doctors tried to stabilize the injured, I stood in silence, looking at the corpses. I recognized a face. It was one of the surgeons who had worked with me years ago. The skin on his face had been completely removed, exposing the facial muscles. I felt nauseous but held it back. Andres had left nothing to chance. This had all been deliberate, methodical. An act of madness, yes, but also of precision. That night in the morgue was an absolute defeat. Despite our efforts, none of the injured survived. The bodies were moved to another room, and the hospital tried to regain some sense of normalcy, though we knew it would never be the same. As I left the morgue, my soul heavy and my mind clouded, a colleague informed me that Andres had been captured by the police. They found him in a motel, calm, as if nothing had happened. He didn't resist and confessed to everything. His trial was brief. He pleaded guilty to every charge and accepted his sentence without hesitation. The death penalty came just a month later. The news spread quickly, and though I felt I had no business being there, something in me led me to the prison on the day of his execution. I was given a spot in a small room, separated from the execution chamber by a glass window. When I entered, it was just him and me. No one else had come to say goodbye to Andres Salgado. He was seated, his hands cuffed. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled, but it wasn't the macabre smile I had learned to fear during our years together. It was a tired, broken smile, almost human. We looked at each other for a long time, in silence, as if words were useless in that moment. I didn't try to speak. What could I say to someone like him? Shortly after, the process began. Andres showed no fear or resistance. He died without uttering a single word, but that last smile remained etched in my memory. I left the prison with a strange feeling, a mix of relief and emptiness. On one hand, I knew the world was a safer place without him. On the other, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Had there been signs from the beginning that I refused to see? Was it my negligence, my desire to ignore the uncomfortable, that allowed all of this to happen? Maybe I would never have the answers. Death, I thought, does not discriminate. It comes for us all, even those who study and manipulate it as if it were a mere phenomenon. Andres had tried to understand it, to master it, and in that attempt, he lost all traces of humanity. But in the end, even he had to face it, and he did so like everyone else, alone. As I walked back home, I decided there was no point in carrying guilt I couldn't change. Andres had made his choices, and I had made mine. All that was left for me was to remember him as a reminder of what happens when we forget that, even in the coldness of death, there are limits we must not cross. Next story. I am Dr. Emiliano Vargas, a forensic pathologist. My life is defined by the dead. While others flee the silence of the morgue, I find it comforting. Death, though macabre, has a logic that the living rarely understand. Or at least, that's what I thought. That night seemed like any other. The morgue was enveloped in absolute silence, interrupted only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tap of my pencil against the notebook. They had left me a body to autopsy, a man in his 50s who, according to the report, had died of a heart attack. I began with the standard procedure, opening the thoracic cavity as the fluorescent light bathed the surgical table. But that's when I noticed it for the first time. Something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. I turned my head sharply, searching for what I had seen. There was nothing. The room was empty as always. I chuckled to myself, attributing it to fatigue. My night shift was stretching on too long. I returned to the corpse, focusing on examining the internal organs. However, the feeling of being watched persisted. When I looked up, for a brief moment, I swore I saw a dark figure on the other side of the room, just at the edge of the shadows. It was tall, elongated, with an irregular outline that seemed to dissolve into the air. A chill ran down my spine. I froze, unable to look away. But when I blinked, it was gone. I took a deep breath and shook my head, trying to shake off the impression. Just your imagination, I told myself, though my instincts said otherwise. I continued with the autopsy, more alert but trying to ignore the small movements that now seemed to fill my peripheral vision. When I finished, I closed up the man and prepared to record the details in the system. As I typed, the lights flickered briefly. Nothing unusual in such an old building, but when I looked up at the lamps, I felt something was right behind me. I turned slowly, holding my breath. And there it was, this time closer. A dark shadow, faceless, that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't move, but it wasn't static either. It was as if its form pulsed, constantly shifting at its edges. I stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back. The figure vanished in an instant, as if it had never been there. That night, I didn't finish my report. I locked the morgue and left as quickly as my legs would carry me. When I got home, I sat in the darkness of my living room, wondering if exhaustion and isolation had started playing tricks on me. But something inside me knew those shadows weren't a product of my mind. And the worst part, I felt I hadn't seen the last of them. Nights in the morgue had always been quiet, almost monotonous. But after that first vision, every time I closed the door behind me, I felt something was waiting. And it didn't take long for me to confirm that the shadows were still there. The second time happened while I was examining a young woman who had died in a car accident. It was a routine procedure, but my mind was restless. The feeling of being watched grew with every minute I spent under those flickering lights. I was closing the abdominal cavity when I saw it again. A shadow, this time more defined, at the end of the room. Its outline seemed to twist, and though it had no face, I felt it was looking directly at me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the cold room. There was no response, but the figure slid into a corner, disappearing as if dissolving into the wall. I tried to convince myself it was stress, accumulated fatigue. But when I turned back to the corpse, I saw something that made me step back. The woman's eyes, which had remained closed since I received her, were now open. It was impossible. I knew it. I checked my notes, the cameras, everything. But the cameras showed nothing unusual, and my notes clearly indicated that the eyes had been closed when I started the autopsy. Yet, there they were, fixed on the ceiling, empty and dead, but with an intensity that seemed to mock me. That night I barely slept. And when I did, I dreamed of shadows surrounding me, whispering unintelligible things, enveloping me in a darkness I couldn't escape. Over the week, the hallucinations worsened. The shadows appeared more frequently, moving between the tables or standing still in the darkest corners. But the most terrifying part was that only I could see them. "Are you feeling okay, doctor?" Clara, the nurse, asked me one night as she left some reports on my desk. "Yes, just tired," I lied, trying not to seem affected. I couldn't tell her what was happening. No one would believe me. But the strangest thing was that Clara and the others acted as if everything were normal, as if those shadows didn't exist. One night, while analyzing a new body, I felt a change in the atmosphere, as if the air had grown heavy. I looked around and saw a dozen shadows surrounding me, forming a circle. This time, they didn't disappear when I blinked. They remained there, motionless, watching me without eyes. One of them approached. I could feel a freezing cold on my skin, as if all the warmth in my body were being drained. I was paralyzed, unable to move. And then I heard it, a murmur, barely a whisper, that seemed to come from all the shadows at once. "You shouldn't have stayed." I didn't understand what those words meant, but their tone was threatening. When I tried to move, I felt something invisible gripping my wrists, as if those shadows were extending their presence beyond the visual. When they finally released me, the shadows vanished, and the corpse in front of me seemed completely normal. But something inside me knew this wasn't just any warning. It was a promise of something darker to come. I started avoiding my colleagues' gazes, fearing they might notice my deterioration. But the most terrifying part was that, every night, the shadows seemed to get closer. And though I still didn't know what they wanted, I had the horrifying certainty that they weren't mere hallucinations. My body and mind were at their limit. Each day was worse, Insomnia, trembling hands, a constant feeling that something was following me even outside the morgue. My colleagues began to notice my state. Their questions were always the same: "Are you okay, doctor? Are you sure you don't need a break?" That's when I decided to talk to Carlos, a close friend and colleague at the hospital. I didn't tell him everything I couldn't. How could I explain that I saw shadows whispering and surrounding the corpses? I only told him I was having intense hallucinations. Carlos looked at me with a mix of concern and discretion. "Look, this is complicated," he said in a low voice. "I can't prescribe you anything officially, but I have some pills I prescribed to a patient a while ago. They're legal, of course, but they shouldn't show up on your record. I can get them for you." I accepted without much thought. That same night, I started taking them. To my surprise, they worked. The shadows faded. The morgue returned to being just that, a cold room with lifeless bodies that meant nothing more than work. My hands stopped trembling, and I could sleep again. For the first time in weeks, the world regained its normalcy. However, there was one exception. I don't know when I first saw her, but now she's always there. She's a tall figure, completely human in appearance, wearing a white lab coat and round glasses that give her an academic air. She makes no noise, doesn't move much. She's just there, always at the side of the room watching me. Sometimes, when I look up, I realize she's staring at me. Not with malice or threat, but with a silent judgment. It's as if she's evaluating every move I make, every decision I take. At first, I tried to ignore her. I thought she was a last vestige of the hallucinations, something that would eventually disappear. But she hasn't. She stays with me night after night. Sometimes I feel she's judging me, as if my sanity were under constant scrutiny. But there's something else, something that deeply unsettles me. The gaze behind those glasses doesn't feel unfamiliar. It's as if I know her, as if she's been with me long before all this. I know I'm not crazy. I can't be. Because if I were, that would mean all of this. The shadows, the whispers, the figure in the corner of the room, was a product of my mind. But it wasn't. I'm not crazy. He is. And as I write this, I feel his gaze fixed on me, silent and constant. Maybe he'll never leave, but at least now I know I can live with it. After all, it's not so bad to have company, even if it's just the ghost of my own creation. Next story. My name is Dr. Santiago Rivero, and I have been working at the city's forensic morgue for over 15 years. I've seen it all: horrific accidents, atrocious crimes, and diseases that consume the body like fire. But nothing had prepared me for what happened that night. It was a rainy evening, and the constant tapping of raindrops on the roof echoed like a macabre metronome as I began my night shift. I had barely been there an hour when they brought in the body. The corpse belonged to a young man, around 30 years old. According to the preliminary report, he had been found in a park on the outskirts of the city, sitting on a bench with his eyes open, as if he were contemplating something invisible. There were no signs of violence or obvious illness. It was a strange case, but not unheard of, or so I thought at first. The body was on the gurney when I approached to examine it closely. Something about it unsettled me. His skin, though pale, didn't show the usual rigor mortis. It was as if time hadn't touched his tissues. I touched him with gloved hands and felt an odd flexibility, as if he had just died, even though the report indicated he had been dead for at least 12 hours. I began the autopsy following the usual protocol. When I opened the thoracic cavity, I found something baffling. The organs were intact, in perfect condition, as if they belonged to someone completely healthy. However, the heart was empty, without a single drop of blood. I checked every vessel, every artery. There were no external or internal wounds to justify that absence. It was as if all his blood had vanished without a trace. My curiosity turned to unease when I examined the brain. Upon removing the skull cap, I noticed an anomalous texture. It was hardened, but not in a typical way. It was as if the brain matter had partially fossilized. Additionally, the spinal cord was a dark, almost black color, something I had never seen in my career. It was 3 in the morning when my head started to ache. I took a break and decided to review the security footage from the autopsy room, something I always do as a precaution. The recordings showed nothing unusual until I reached the 2:45 a.m. mark. At that moment, the corpse moved. A slight spasm in the left hand, barely perceptible but enough to chill my blood. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a late muscle reflex, something that sometimes happens with recent corpses. But as I watched the video frame by frame, I noticed something else. In one frame, his face looked different. His lips, which had been closed when he was brought in, now showed a slight upward curve. It was a smile. A shiver ran down my spine. I stopped breathing for a moment as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an error in the recording. Yet my instincts told me otherwise. I turned off the cameras and returned to the body. I examined it closely, but it remained motionless, as lifeless as before. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I wasn't alone in that room. That night, I didn't finish the autopsy. I locked the room and left with my heart pounding. I couldn't sleep when I got home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile in my mind, as if, somehow, the corpse had carried part of its mystery into my home. The next day began with the usual monotony, though the memory of the previous night still haunted me like a ghost. As I entered the morgue, Clara, the nurse, intercepted me with a tense expression. "Dr. Rivero, more bodies have arrived. 8 in total, including last night's. And there's a forensic officer waiting for you in the main room." I frowned, trying to process what I had just heard. 8 bodies was an unusual number for a single shift, and the presence of a forensic officer indicated something serious. When I entered the room, the officer was already there, reviewing some documents while observing the lined-up gurneys. He was a burly man with short hair and a grave expression. When he saw me, he extended his hand. "Dr. Rivero, I'm Officer Guzman. I'm here to oversee. The situation is peculiar, to put it mildly." My eyes scanned the gurneys. 8 bodies, including the one from the park, were lined up, covered with white sheets. I felt a knot in my stomach. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "The cases are similar to the one you already have in the morgue," Guzman replied, pointing to the bodies. "No signs of violence, no external wounds, no apparent illnesses, and no blood." "How is that possible?" I inquired, trying to maintain my composure. Guzman sighed and crossed his arms. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. I've examined some of the bodies at another morgue and found nothing. Not a single clue as to how the blood was extracted or what killed them. The reason I'm here is purely procedural. The police office wants us to report immediately if you find anything, though, to be honest, I don't think you will." I didn't find anything myself. The resignation in his voice sparked something in me. I couldn't accept a mystery without an answer, not after what I had seen. That night, I dedicated myself to the bodies with almost obsessive precision. I started with the most basic process, a detailed visual inspection of the skin and natural orifices. Nothing. Not a single mark, not a clue as to how the blood could have been drained. I moved on to dissections. I opened the thoracic cavities of 2 of the new bodies. The organs were intact, like the first one, but completely dry. Their hearts seemed like empty shells, with no signs of trauma. Examining the blood vessels was equally fruitless. They were empty, but there were no signs of collapse or scarring to indicate extraction. I tried microscopic analyses, looking for traces of toxins, foreign compounds, or bacteria that could have caused death. The results were normal. The tissues, seemingly healthy, revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Desperate, I resorted to more advanced techniques: MRIs, gas chromatography, even genetic analyses. Everything came back normal. It was as if these bodies had been stripped of their blood by an invisible force. As I worked, the image of the park corpse lingered in my mind. That smile, that disturbing curve on the lips I had seen in the video. Something about it told me it was the key. I decided to review the footage again. I turned on the computer, searched for the file, and prepared to confirm what I had seen the previous night. But when I reached the exact moment, the frame was clean. There was no spasm, no movement, no smile. The corpse remained motionless the entire time. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Had I imagined it? Was something else playing with my mind? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. Those corpses weren't dead in the conventional sense. There was something more, something that eluded me but was beginning to take shape in the shadows. That night, I didn't leave the morgue. I couldn't leave those bodies without solving the mystery. What I didn't know then was that they, in silence, had already begun to watch me. The early hours of the morning dragged on as I continued my work. I had spent hours dissecting, analyzing, and trying to find something, anything, that could explain what had happened to those bodies. I was absorbed in my notes when something caught my attention. One of the corpses wasn't on the table I remembered. At first, I thought it was a mistake on my part, a distraction from exhaustion, but upon closer inspection, I noticed that all the bodies had changed places. Not randomly, they seemed to have swapped positions as if someone had moved them. I stood up and walked around the room, mentally retracing where I had placed each one at the start of the night. I had no doubt. They were on different tables. But how? I went straight to review the security camera footage. I played back the previous hours, frame by frame, looking for any movement, any sign that someone had entered. But the images were normal. No corpses moved, no one had entered the room, and yet, there they were, defying logic. The uncertainty gnawed at me as the sun began to filter through the morgue windows. My thoughts were in chaos when a group of uniformed men entered without warning. They wore dark suits, federal badges, and their demeanor was as imposing as it was disconcerting. "We're here for the bodies," one of them said, not bothering to introduce himself. "What? Why?" I replied, confused. The corpses had only been in the morgue for a day. There was no reason to move them so quickly. "Don't ask," was all he said, in a tone so sharp it brooked no argument. I tried to insist, but it was useless. Within minutes, the 8 bodies were removed, placed in black bags, and loaded into an unmarked van. When they left, the morgue fell into a sepulchral silence. I didn't know what was more unsettling, what had happened to the bodies or the way they had been taken, as if they were secrets that should never have reached my hands. That afternoon, I checked the news, searching for something, any mention of the bloodless bodies. But there was nothing. No reports of the bloodless corpses, no references to the cases, not even rumors. It was as if those men had never existed. Now, as I write this, I feel a mix of frustration and fear. Frustration because I never found the answers I was looking for, and fear because I know that something bigger, something I can't comprehend, is behind all of this. Perhaps we'll never know the truth about those corpses. Perhaps we don't want to know. But one thing is certain. In this world, there are silences more terrifying than any scream. Next story. My name is Julian Herrera, and I am an autopsy technician at the Central Morgue in San Vicente, a building of dark bricks and sealed windows that seems to absorb the daylight. It is located in an industrial neighborhood of the city, surrounded by abandoned factories and deserted streets. I work the night shift, when life seems to pause and death takes center stage. The first night I set foot in this place, I thought I would get used to its coldness, the metallic smell that clings to your skin, and the echoes that resonate through the empty hallways. But the morgue has its own rhythm, one that dictates who enters and who does not leave. That particular night, I was accompanied by Elena Rios, an experienced forensic doctor and my supervisor. She was a serious-looking woman, with eyes that seemed to have seen more than any person should. We were examining a body that had just arrived. A man named Sebastián Morales, 42 years old, found dead in an abandoned building. The preliminary cause, suicide. While Elena dictated her report, I prepared the tools for the autopsy. There was something strange about the corpse. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror, as if he had seen something unimaginable before dying. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work. When I opened the body, I noticed something peculiar. The marks on his arms and legs did not match self-inflicted wounds. They looked like bite marks, but not from any known animal. They were small and deep, as if something tiny but unusually strong had sunk its teeth into his flesh. "What is this?" I asked, pointing to the marks. Elena approached and frowned. "I don't know," she replied in a low voice. "Take photographs and document everything. This isn't normal." The room felt colder than usual, and the silence was so thick that I could hear my own breathing. As I took the photos, I noticed that the marks formed a pattern. It was almost as if they told a story, a spiral descending toward the abdomen. When I looked up, something caught my attention. The lights flickered, and for a second, I swore the corpse had moved a finger. "Did you see that?" I asked, but Elena didn't respond. She was staring at the corpse with wide eyes, her face completely pale. "We need to finish quickly," she finally said, almost in a whisper. I didn't want to press further, but something told me that night would be different. And it was. The rest of the autopsy proceeded in tense silence. Elena seemed uneasy, and I couldn't get that movement out of my head, even though I knew that dead muscles could contract due to residual electrical reflexes. I repeated that to myself over and over, trying to calm down. When we finished documenting the injuries, I took the body to the refrigeration chamber. The morgue had a long hallway with numbered doors on both sides, and the fluorescent light flickered slightly, as if the entire building was breathing erratically. I placed Morales' body in compartment number 7, closed the door, and returned to the autopsy area. I found Elena reviewing old files on her computer. Her face was illuminated by the glow of the screen, and her fingers trembled slightly on the keyboard. I approached slowly. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "These marks," she replied without looking at me. "They're not the first I've seen." Her confession left me frozen. "What do you mean?" 6 years ago, we had a similar case. Another man found dead under suspicious circumstances. Same marks, same expression on his face. It was ruled a suicide, but something didn't add up. Before I could respond, a sharp noise echoed from the refrigeration chamber hallway. It was a dull thud, as if someone had slammed a door shut. We looked at each other in silence. "Was that the wind?" I asked, though I knew how absurd it sounded. There were no windows or drafts there. Elena grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the hallway. I hesitated for a moment but followed her, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up with every step. When we arrived, we saw that the door to compartment number 7 was slightly ajar. "Didn't you close it properly?" Elena asked, her voice tense. "I'm sure I did," I replied, my heart pounding. Elena opened the door fully and checked inside. The body was still there, lifeless, but something was wrong. The marks on the skin seemed deeper, as if they had been made recently. Additionally, there was now a new mark, a curved line running along the neck and ending at the chest, like a strange symbol. "This wasn't here before," Elena murmured, taking a step back. Suddenly, a sound froze our blood. It was a whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin crawl. It seemed to come from inside the compartment, as if something was murmuring in a language we didn't understand. Elena slammed the door shut and looked at me, pale. "We need to get out of here." "Now, what's happening?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she confessed. "And things never end well." Before I could process her words, all the lights in the hallway went out, plunging us into complete darkness. And in that darkness, the whisper grew louder. But this time, it wasn't coming from the chamber. It was coming from right behind us. We ran down the hallway as the whisper grew more intense. It was an unnatural sound, as if thousands of voices were intertwining in a constant murmur that pursued us. The hallway lights flickered more and more until everything was swallowed by deep darkness, as if the entire morgue had been devoured by a shadow. "Keep running," Elena shouted, grabbing my arm. The darkness was total, but somehow, the hallway seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if we would never reach the door. And then the floor shook. The earthquake took us by surprise. A violent tremor caused the metal drawers of the refrigeration chambers to open and close like metal jaws. I tripped and fell to the ground, while Elena yanked me up. "Come on. This isn't normal," she shouted, but her voice was lost in the noise of the creaking walls. We managed to get out of the hallway and reach the main area of the hospital, where chaos had taken over. Doctors and nurses were running around, helping patients who had been injured by the quake. Broken glass covered the floor, and the emergency generator wasn't working. For the first time in years, the entire hospital was in complete darkness. "We need to go back to the morgue and check the body," I told Elena, but she shook her head, panting. "There's no time for that, Julian. We have injured people everywhere. Help now, and we'll figure out what to do later." During the 10 minutes the hospital was without power, chaos reigned. People with fractures, deep cuts, and a woman who could barely breathe due to debris that had fallen on her chest were brought in. Elena joined the medical staff, while I did what I could to assist with flashlights and move the injured. When the lights finally came back on, everything seemed like a disaster. The hallways were filled with stretchers, the medical staff was at their limit, and alarms were sounding in different parts of the hospital. Only then did I remember Sebastián Morales' body. "I have to go back to the morgue," I murmured, more to myself than to anyone else. Elena looked at me from the other end of the hallway, as if she had read my thoughts. She approached, exhausted and with sweat on her forehead. "I went during the blackout," she said in a low voice. "The body is gone." My stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "Compartment 7 was empty when I opened it," she replied, her voice slightly breaking. "I checked everything, but there was no sign of him." I wanted to speak, but something in her gaze stopped me. It wasn't just fear, it was resignation. As if she knew something I didn't yet understand. Before I could insist, a doctor called us. "We need all the help we can get. More injured are arriving." The morgue took a back seat as the entire hospital mobilized to attend to the earthquake victims. But something kept nagging at my mind. The body had disappeared during the blackout, and those strange marks seemed more than just wounds. The next day, I was called to a meeting with the hospital directors and the morgue staff. It was in the conference room, a cold space with gray walls and long wooden tables that seemed as immutable as the hospital's own rules. Everyone present looked at me expectantly, waiting for an explanation. Dr. Ramirez, a gray-haired man with a deep voice that seemed to fill the room, was the first to speak. "Mr. Herrera, we understand that last night there were extraordinary circumstances, but we need you to explain how it's possible that a body disappeared from our facilities." I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. My mind was racing, remembering the marks on the body, the whispers, and the earthquake. But I knew I couldn't talk about that. If I did, I would most likely be labeled as crazy and ruin my career. During the earthquake, the entire hospital was plunged into chaos. I began, avoiding eye contact with Elena, who was at the back of the room, staring at me intently. There was a moment when we completely lost power, and in the morgue, the security systems also failed. The compartment doors opened due to the shaking. Murmurs began to spread through the room. Dr. Ramirez raised a hand to silence everyone. "Are you saying the body simply disappeared?" he asked, his tone filled with skepticism. "I believe someone took advantage of the blackout and the chaos to enter and steal it," I replied firmly, though the lie burned in my throat. "I don't have definitive proof, but it's the only logical explanation." A younger doctor, Dr. Alvarez, frowned. "Body theft? For what?" Elena, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke up. "Organ trafficking," she said, crossing her arms. "It wouldn't be the first time it's happened in this city. There are groups that extract organs from unclaimed bodies." Her voice was calculated, as if she was protecting me with her explanation. The others nodded slowly, accepting the possibility. But in her gaze I saw something more. She knew the truth was much darker. Dr. Ramirez finally stood up. "All right, we'll register the case as a body theft for organ trafficking. But I want a thorough review of the morgue's security protocols. This cannot happen again." The meeting ended shortly after, and although officially the disappearance was justified, I couldn't get what had really happened out of my head. When I left the room, Elena caught up with me in the hallway. "You did the right thing by not mentioning the marks or anything we saw," she said in a low voice. "This isn't something they can understand." "What was that, Elena?" I asked, desperate for answers. She stopped and looked at me, her face somber. "I don't know. But it wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. I recommend you don't investigate further. There are things it's better not to understand." That last sentence left me uneasy, as if she was hiding more than she was willing to admit. Since then, I haven't stopped doubting Elena. Her behavior that night, her calculated calm, everything makes me wonder if she knew more than she let on, if she had something to do with what happened. To this day, I don't know if what we experienced was a paranormal event or if she played a role in all of it. And that uncertainty eats away at me.